Again?
Mm-hmm.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Dissenter Weekly update for November 27th, 2019. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor for shadowproof.com. I'm pleased to be joined by...
I'm Brian Sonnenstein, publishing editor for Shadowproof.
And as you can see, we're off to a little awkward start. We're figuring this all out. This week we've got the service StreamYard that we're using because YouTube is changing how they do this all. They're apparently abandoning their Hangout model. And we're really open and transparent about figuring this out. And for those of you who are watching and tuning in to us as we talk about these whistleblower stories, as you have comments and suggestions about the way we're live streaming, please give us any tips, advice, or any thoughts you have on how to make this all better. And also let us know what you're seeing. And if you like what we're doing, let us know that as well, because that'll be a boost to our consciences and our egos to make us feel like we're actually figuring this out correctly. So each week we're going to run down the latest news in whistleblowing and related press freedom stories. For this week, we're looking at some stories that involve whistleblowers in immigration agencies that are challenging and have significant questions about and reservations about how asylum proceedings are being managed. We're going to look at Googlers who have some whistleblowing that they're doing. We're going to talk about Julian Assange and his health. We're going to look at comments that Trump made about Chelsea Manning, and then also get to WikiLeaks' publication of some documents and related to the OPCW report on the chemical weapons attack, the alleged chemical weapons attack in Syria. And so that'll be what we cover for this week. So let's get right to it. But I want Brian to give you a reminder first.
Yes, just really quick. Please remember to hit the red subscribe button below in order to follow our show and get notifications for when we go live. And please also remember that we are a 100% reader-funded website. Our ability to do this show and all of our work at Shadow Financial Support. And if you want to help us sustain the show and grow Shadowproof, you can help us at shadowproof.com/donate. So yeah, Kevin, let's take it away. Why don't you start us off with our first story?
Yeah, thanks. So this week, this past week, we had Senator Jeff Merkley, who is a senator from Oregon in the United States. He was involved in putting together this important report on the asylum process. The name of the report is called Shattered Refuge, a U.S. Senate investigation into the Trump administration's gutting of asylum. And it included two parts. One part of this report looks at and examines how the administration is stopping families who are fleeing persecution from getting this asylum. And then there was a part two that looked at the destruction of the asylum system and how there are whistleblowers within these agencies and government who have objected. And the two key findings I wanted to point out and highlight from the Merkley report is they're outlined here at Merkley's website. So I'm just going to read here for you. When asylum officers found that an applicant had a legitimate reason to fear staying in Mexico until their asylum court date, those decisions were reviewed by political supervisors. Decisions to send migrants back to Mexico were not reviewed, while decisions that migrants should remain in the U.S. for their safety were forwarded on to supervisors, and in some cases all the way up to headquarters. Whistleblowers reported in nearly all cases where asylum officers found that asylum seekers should be allowed to await their hearing within the U.S. for safety reasons, they were overruled by their supervisors, with one whistleblower reporting that it would take, quote, Herculean efforts, end quote, to get final approval on any recommendation to allow an asylum seeker to wait in the U.S. So this is a big deal because we know that we've had immigration attorneys describing how the Trump administration has adopted this remain in Mexico policy. And so you're effectively forcing people who are already escaping dangers, already leaving their homes for safety, being forced to live in some cities in Mexico that are just as plagued with violence, where there are just as many risks, where Mexico doesn't really want them either. And while they're trying to get this asylum, they have to stay there. And now we have confirmation that there are people internally that are objecting to the way that this is being managed. There's another point to make here about the trained asylum officers who are strenuously objecting to being forced to implement the administration's programs, such as this Remain in Mexico policy that I just mentioned, that appear to be in clear violation of domestic and international asylum law. One whistleblower who refused to participate on both legal and moral grounds wrote in a letter that, quote, implementation of a program for which there is no legal authority violates my oath to office. The asylum officer noted that the U.S. is bound by law not to discriminate against refugees on the basis of their race, religion, or nationality, and not to penalize those refugees for how they enter the country to claim asylum. However, this Remain in Mexico policy discriminates and penalizes. Implementation of the MPP, the Remain in Mexico policy, is clearly designed to further this administration's racist agenda of keeping Hispanic and Latino populations from entering the United States. So that's clearly a big deal. It has a lot of ramifications, and just knowing what I know about whistleblower cases, we'll want to follow how those move. Do those people who are raising their objections internally decide to go public? Do they decide to come forward and make their reservations known? Are we going to see them in media interviews? Is there anything that they're going to disclose or maybe leak so that we can have more insights into how the Trump administration is enacting these racist policies? Something that we need to pay close attention to going forward. Anything else you think I needed to hit, Brian?
No, I think that nails it. I think that we've seen, obviously this is a new development in the Trump administration. We've seen a steady escalation in deterrence policies over the past decade or more, and, impacted people who have been impacted by the deterrence strategy and the targeting of asylum seekers for decade or more have been speaking to these challenges. And, I think that our inability to take those voices seriously has led to this point. So I just kind of wanted to underscore the voices of impacted people in that. But yeah, that was great. Can we go on to maybe the next story with Google, and you can tell us about that?
Yeah. So this one will be really brief, but I just wanted to flag it as something that people could track. Sarah Emerson over at Medium, one of Medium's columns, wrote something on Googlers rallying in San Francisco over the company's attempt to silence workers. And I think that in the broader context of the sort of worker activism, the efforts to unionize that we've seen throughout the United States, we have these workers who are upset with Google and the way they're treating workers, and 2 employees were placed on leave the past month, allegedly for violating company policies, and they feel that they're being excluded and mistreated, that because they've challenged unethical decisions by Google, that perhaps they're being singled out. Their names were Lawrence Berland and Rebecca Rivers, and they spoke at a protest. They alleged that they were suspended without warning in retaliation for opposing Google's stance on the use of its technology by government agencies and other private industries. And Google did not confirm that these were the people who were placed on leave, but they themselves personally are saying that they've tried to warn Google about what they're doing. And I think that this is really important to follow. Rivers works at Google's Boulder, Colorado office, and helped create a petition protesting Google's relations with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And she was suspended after accessing internal files and sharing them with other Googlers. So it sounds like she's being punished because she's used Google's own files to challenge their policies that are supporting the President Donald Trump's administration in its efforts to engage in mass deportations. And so this relates to actually our first story, although I actually didn't plan it that way. But it's a nice coincidence that there's a connection there. And So we'll keep an eye on this. We'll see if either of these employees actually get fired. Do we see more come forward? Do we see people leave? You certainly, on one hand, you want to see employees inside these massive mega corporations that have so much control over our lives being able to change what the companies are doing. But you know that when they do bring up their ethical concerns, that as we see in governments, you often get forced out. So it might be that we find people outside having to agitate and challenge people. I really apologize, but my furnace has just kicked on in my apartment, and that's a loud noise in the background. So I'm going to just get up out of my chair very awkwardly and go turn that down so that it is not disrupting the rest of this live stream. And then I'll be right back to complete the show.
No problem. It is getting cold where both of us live, in Chicago and in Maine. I just wanted to add, Kevin mentioned in the piece that there's been other reporting around firings and disciplines related to workplace organizing. Like he said, in this case, we're talking about Google organizing against the company's work with with ICE. But, they're also using unauthorized access as a pretext for firing employees who are engaged in union organizing as well, like Kevin mentioned. And so I just wanted to connect that, to what's going on in Google as a whole right now, and definitely something that we should keep an eye on, given the size and the level of involvement that Google has in and asylum process. So yeah, you got the heater. The heater's good now.
Yeah, we're all set to complete this. Thank you. Why don't we do? I don't know what order you've got back there, but let's do the WikiLeaks story that I have for uploading for the document on the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons.
Absolutely.
And then we'll tackle the Chelsea Manning story and the Julian Assange story that we have for this week.
Perfect. Take it away.
Yeah, so WikiLeaks, again, and I think this is an important point to make, that they continue to put out publications. We mentioned one that got virtually no attention outside of a couple countries last week related to Iceland. But, now we've got this, which goes back to something that they were involved in earlier this year, drawing attention to whistleblowers within the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons that investigated allegations of a chemical attack that took place in the Syrian city of Douma on April 7th of 2018. And this was a big attack. There was a lot of claims thrown around in the media that Bashar al-Assad was indisputably responsible for gassing people in Syria. And now what WikiLeaks has been allowing to show is that when the OPCW conducted their investigation to confirm whether Assad was in fact the culprit, that the way in which this fact-finding mission was engaged in, and then particularly when the report was put together to show people what these fact finders were able to glean, that there are people within the OPCW who have objections. And so WikiLeaks put out an email recently that came from a member who claimed that the redacted preliminary version of the report misrepresented facts, and that his colleagues discovered other aspects of what was happening with the attack on the ground, and that eventually what's in the report that we all saw, the public report about this attack, is a morphed version of what was actually found in the report. It was widely attributed to the Syrian army that this attack happened, and that before the fact-finding team had gained access to the site in Douma, this was mostly the conclusion. There was no waiting to come to any conclusions about what Assad may or may not have done. And upon arrival, as WikiLeaks states in their release, the team found much of the physical evidence, including the bodies of the deceased, were no longer available. It was alleged that 49 had died and up to 650 had been seriously affected by the weaponized chemical gas released in a specific area of rebel-held Doma on that day in April. Rebels claim that the gas came from cylinders dropped from aircraft, clearly implicating Syrian government forces. But the redacted report seemed to support those conclusions. But the author of this email that WikiLeaks received said that it was particularly worrisome the way that this was morphed. And I think the biggest issue is that the statement in the redacted report, it states that there is sufficient evidence to determine the presence of chlorine or another reactive chlorine-containing chemical, but the email points out that there was likely one or more chemicals that contain a reactive chlorine atom. Such chemicals could include the major ingredient of household chlorine-based bleach. Purposely singling out chlorine gas as one of the possibilities is disingenuous. So that's one example. And I won't go into more detail. I mean, I think this is going to continue to have ramifications and reverberate. I think the only critical point is to say that, people who share a politics where they are skeptical of U.S. foreign policy, I think really need to take an interest in what these whistleblowers are doing in coming forward to take this as something that needs to be questioned. And that we shouldn't cede ground to conservative media who have critiques of Obama's foreign policy or have critiques to the foreign policy of interventionism from xenophobic or racist points of view. That we shouldn't just let the Fox News commentators control the conversation of Syria and give this some sort of credence. That we also need progressive media, that we need media that are like-minded like us to care about this as well, and to take seriously what WikiLeaks is disclosing, because I think it's something that we really should take an interest in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what you think, Kevin, but I am continuously surprised by, especially those of us who grew up under the wars of the Bush administration, and those of us who learned the hard way that war depends on lies, that we wouldn't, particularly among the left, react so quickly and with such certainty to news of attacks like what happened in Duma. And, I think it would do us all, to your point, I think we would all benefit from being able to sit with that skepticism and sort of reject a need to feel certain about what's happened in a theater of war.
Yeah, well,
immediately after.
I'll refer back to our shadowproof coverage when this attack first happened in 2018, and maybe we might share a couple of our links if we think it's still important and worth connecting to what WikiLeaks is doing here. But I was not certain of what happened, but I felt confident that it was worth asking questions about how the news media could draw these concrete conclusions about what had taken place. Because I know from covering and having colleagues in media that I've spoken to raise concerns that there are jihadist groups that are in Syria that have been empowered and emboldened by our own regime change policy, that have benefited, that we've tacitly supported indirectly, if not directly, and that there are weapons that we've been putting into Syria in the last 5 to 10 years that have gotten lost, that are no longer in our control. There are stockpiles of these weapons that can be used, and we don't know where they are, who exactly has gotten control over them. And I think some of the worst cases, they have maybe even ended up in the hands of groups that are tied or might actually be a part of the Islamic State. And so this is really something that we need to be more interested in trying to figure out. What is the responsibility, like who is responsible for all of this? And it's not entirely the government's fault that a lot of this is happening. There are others on the other side that are involved in violence. And I think we need to just recognize that they have just as much of an interest in getting propaganda that can convince the world that they need more assistance in waging war. And I believe that that's the crucial element of what the OPCW whistleblowers are pointing out, is that we're so viscerally bothered by these videos, these images of children that are put out, and we think immediately that shows that this was an attack, and we know exactly who was responsible. And the videos actually don't necessarily give us any evidence of who the culprit is. And the only way we can find out is by doing these kind of fact-finding investigations. But then now we're seeing that those fact-finding missions are compromised, and that they have to worry about the powers that be, the Western world, and the way that they control what happens in these regions, and the way that they influence and drive conflicts. And so that's what WikiLeaks is doing, is calling into question the process that those people are engaged in, and whether it can actually give us a fair reading of what happened with these attacks.
Absolutely. Why don't you take us to our next story? Did you want to talk about Donald Trump and Chelsea Manning?
Yeah. All right. So I've got the quote, and I don't really do Donald Trump impressions, so I'm just going to read this straight up here. And this is what he had to say about Chelsea Manning. I'm missing the part where he misgendered her deliberately or slipped up. I mean, it's hard to tell. He's actually using her name and never says the thing that you get from a lot of trolls, which is, it's Bradley. It's always been Bradley. But he did at one point say there was a young gentleman. I don't have that part here, but I had the part that I think is more crucially important. The person I'm talking about is Chelsea Manning. By the way, if you had any doubt, so you have Chelsea Manning, who after Chelsea Manning was, I assume, pardoned by President Obama, Chelsea Manning went around and badmouthed President Obama on top of everything else. So when you have a Chelsea Manning who stole classified information and did many, many things that were not good and gets pardoned or whatever happened, and you have a Sergeant Bergdahl who gets virtually nothing, happens, a slap on the wrist, and then they want to put these warriors in jail for 25 years. One of them, Lawrence, served 6 years in jail, had many years left as a fighter. No, we're not going to do that to our people. All right, so just to back up for a moment, these comments were delivered in a context of a controversy that's been plaguing Trump administration for the last couple of weeks, where you have the person who was running the Navy pushed out, I believe, because they objected to him wanting to pardon a war criminal, someone who actually ordered officers to shoot and kill Afghans that were on a motorcycle, and had gone through the court-martial process and was serving a sentence in Fort Leavenworth, I believe, which is actually the same. This is where military officers go to serve out their sentences, most of them. That's where Chelsea Manning served her 6 years, was there for 6 years. And so this is remarkable. I mean, obviously, Chelsea Manning was not pardoned, first off. She was given a commutation. So actually, these war criminals are getting even a better show of clemency from Trump than what Obama showed, because they're being given this chance to have their records clean so that they don't have to worry about this history at all going forward. And then you've got the fact that Chelsea Manning exposed war crimes. She actually exposed this kind of conduct, the kinds of incidents that some of these soldiers who are being pardoned engaged in are probably in these military incident reports, whether we're talking Iraq or we're talking Afghanistan. Those hundreds of thousands of documents that were disclosed by Chelsea Manning contain examples of conduct that could result in officers being brought before a court-martial and accused of war crimes. And yet, she is in jail right now. She's in jail because she's resisting this grand jury. She's challenging this grand jury that's trying to destroy WikiLeaks. And this is because Donald Trump feels like he needs to prosecute the journalist and anybody else involved in WikiLeaks, that he feels like letting his Justice Department do this. It's no longer a question in his mind of whether WikiLeaks is useful or not to his political campaigns. They aren't anymore. And so he's willing to let them do this and go after the people who have published information on war crimes. So what you have happening here is really an incredible thing. I think it really shows the I don't know if it's hypocrisy. It's not really hypocrisy. It just shows the dynamic of how people are able to get away with war crimes, but the people who expose war crimes are the ones that have to look over their shoulder and fear that they might face some kind of punishment for telling the truth.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add is that I think what was that Trump was portraying what he was saying as somehow disrupting the status quo, when in reality it's just undergirding the status quo that is behind the prosecution of Chelsea Manning in the first place. And I think that, while it goes without saying that I'm glad that Chelsea was commuted, and I mean, she's in jail again right now, but, to portray what she went through and how it ended as leniency is absurd. She underwent torture, as you reported, for many years. She should never have been detained in the first place. And even if she got out early, instead of having spent 3 decades in prison, she carries the trauma of that incarceration with her every day for likely the rest of her life. So I just think that's what jumped out to me, the idea that, somehow spending all of that time in prison and being tortured with solitary confinement and being made to strip naked and all of that, and somehow that's a slap on the wrist, and Trump is bucking, the status quo by, showing lenient thought, was just astounding, because it is really just a bolstering or like a recommitment to the status quo in the first place.
You make a really important point, which is that we shouldn't believe that this military is naturally inclined to protect the good order and discipline and prosecute people for war crimes. We know from the end of the Iraq War that the Obama administration, that President Barack Obama himself, wanted to see the government in Iraq grant U.S. soldiers immunity for war crimes if they committed them, if they kept a number of residual forces in Iraq to either protect the quote-unquote green zone, or to protect the mega U.S. embassy compound that was built, but to also maybe even be there to assist security forces, that if they were going to be left behind, he wanted them to be able to be excluded from any sort of prosecutions if they engaged in war crimes or other misconduct. And the Iraqi government said, no, we can't give this to you. We won't give this to you. We want to be able to hold people accountable if they commit crimes in our own country. And of course, the Pentagon and the Obama administration officials objected. And so that hastened, in fact, sped up the withdrawal of forces. And part of that was owed to a U.S. cable that was disclosed by Chelsea Manning to WikiLeaks that was published, that showed an example of a raid on a house where there were women and there were children, and they were executed, and some of them were even tortured in the process of being executed. And so ultimately, when you hear this from the people who are the person who resigned from the Navy, talking about how, he's always had it in his heart to protect the good order and discipline of his armed forces, and that he can't abide by what Donald Trump is doing, it's really hard to take that as an act of resistance and think that he's being forthright and honest with people. But then at the same time, that just shows you how extreme this is, what Donald Trump is doing, because, it's like, on one hand, I don't agree with what the person from the Navy is saying, because it seems to be, rose-colored goggles, so to speak. But at the same time, Donald Trump is really, truly pardoning the worst of the worst. These are the people that the system will allow to be punished and won't treat as warriors, but will treat as people who are criminals and butchers and people that you can't defend because what they do doesn't serve a purpose. And then on the other hand, you've got the people in the military who are supposed to create this myth that we're somehow good people wherever we go, and that we're not just killing anything that moves. And so that's where I think this moment crystallizes, as sort of like how extreme things are getting with Trump versus, the mythology of how the military views itself, that Donald Trump is apparently not okay. Like, that's not good enough for Trump. He actually wants everyone to be able to do whatever they want to do. Or I think he just wants to be able to have people like him, and he knows that he can help these people who are going on Fox News and requesting pardons.
Right.
So why don't we end? We've got one more thing we wanted to talk about with Julian Assange from the past week.
Yeah, go for it.
And he had this show of support from medical doctors from several different countries this past week. There was this letter that was written to the UK Home Secretary, Priti Patel, and Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott. And it was this detailed letter with examples, a chronology of a lot of the health problems that have plagued him, aspects that could be shared publicly without compromising him fully. But we already know that there's been a Spanish security company that was spying on the embassy, and all of that information was passed on to the CIA. So the U.S. government knows almost everything that is plaguing Julian Assange medically, whether it involves his mental health or whether it involves his physical health. And so they sent this letter, and it pointed out how he had needed dental assistance, was in need of a root canal. It spoke to how he had gone through psychosocial trauma while being detained in the embassy, pointed out what had happened through interactions, meeting him in the embassy, how he acted as a person, concerns over access to medical care that grew in 2018, and other issues related to the embassy involving the British medical, involving whether he was able to access health issues. And sorry, my furnace just kicked on again, and I absolutely cannot believe that that my home appliance is trying to thwart our ability to do this live stream.
It's actually not that bad.
So I'm just gonna acknowledge that I hear it and try to finish up here. But the thing that I want to mention is this got a lot of attention in global media, and I think that's a credit to the people who are working on Julian Assange's behalf. They got this out there. Whether you were looking at the Washington Post, the New York Times, looking at media that was in the UK, you had the headline that Julian Assange could die in prison. And I think that really sent a message to everyone, what is at stake here? That not only are we talking about the potential for someone to go to prison for several years because they published information, to be put on trial for violating the Espionage Act in the United States, and to cross a threshold in which we cannot come back, where not only are you prosecuting leakers or whistleblowers, but you're able to prosecute journalists for publishing this classified information, that you're able to go after a class of people, dissenters, people like us, people who publish information that those in government do not like, that they would now have a tool in their box that they can use in order to control what is written and published about them. Not only do you have the fact that he might be brought to the United States and put on trial and create a precedent that would be really damaging, but you have the possibility that by going after him for these alleged violations, by bringing this political case, that you may actually be signing his death sentence. That while he is in this Belmarsh, I think it's a maximum security prison, it's where they have it's actually been referred to as a kind of like British Guantanamo in the past, and that the way he's being treated and how he's had trouble working on his legal defense and the psychological trauma that is being compounded by his detention and not being able to be out on bail before he goes through his extradition hearing and then if he's extradited, brought to the United States, that is actually going to result potentially in his death. And it's something that we should be concerned greatly about, especially when you think about why it is that they might be putting him through all of this hardship.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I would underscore that last point completely. I mean, I think his, if there's any sort of semblance of the United States being interested in a fair trial or any of those pretenses. I think it's completely demolished by the way that he has for the last several years been allowed to deteriorate, especially from, perhaps there's other medical conditions that, Assange hasn't, spoken about publicly, but at least the things that we know about in terms of his dental health, in terms of his mental health, those are all things that were not inevitable. Those are definitely, preventable ailments. Would he have had access to medical care? Would he have not been held in de facto solitary confinement in the embassy for several years under extreme surveillance? And I think it just underscores the point that it's not about a free and fair trial for Assange to prove his innocence in a court, or disprove his guilt in a court of law. I just think it's very clear that this is about before he even gets to court, about silencing, if not bringing him within steps of death. I just wanted to add that for sure. Anything that you wanted to add at the end there?
No, I think you make a really good point there, and we can conclude. I wanted to talk about this book that has been released as we wrap, that it is now available for purchase. I contributed to this anthology that was put together by OR Books. You can find it at their website. And I believe that, like a lot of other sites, since we're in the holidays here in the United States, that you might be able to get this for a bargain price if you go there. They also have a deal right now where you can buy In Defense of Julian Assange as a package with a couple other books that have been put out by OR Books on WikiLeaks. One by Julian Assange himself. One that's a conversation, women whistleblowing in WikiLeaks. These are people who have been involved in WikiLeaks publications and the work of WikiLeaks. And so there's a bunch of different contributors that were able to have their work republished in this anthology, or a few of us even wrote original pieces for the anthology. I wrote an original piece, something on Democrats. It's called WikiLeaks and the Democrats. It's about the way that the Democrats have always had resentment towards WikiLeaks tracking it, and seeing how it especially sharpened when Hillary Clinton ran for president in 2016. So you can find that in this book, with some other people: Noam Chomsky, Patrick Coburn, Naomi Colvin, Mark Curtis, Daniel Ellsberg, Charles Glass, Chris Hedges, Nozomi Hayes, Caitlin Johnstone, Margaret Kimberly wrote a really fabulous entry into it about what she called the naivete of Julian Assange, where she suggested that Julian, when he began what he did, when he started to really take on this U.S. empire, that he absolutely didn't understand fully how it could be turned against him, and he didn't exactly recognize what he was getting into. And you can see more of her argument fleshed out in the book. Stefania Morizzi is an Italian journalist who's been doing amazing work as a journalist, particularly on the spying that's been going on, the spy case that we've mentioned here in this show. We'll have to return to and talk about in more detail later. John Pilger, Michael Ratner, the late attorney Michael Ratner from the Center for Constitutional Rights, who did so much amazing work as a civil rights attorney and was working on WikiLeaks before he died a few years ago. That there's a piece at the end of the book from him talking about the stakes, what's at stake with this prosecution against Assange, putting that into perspective. And so you can find this book if you go to orbooks.com. It's In Defense of Julian Assange. I've been sharing the link to it. We'll share it around with our own social media as well again. And maybe there's some parts of it, there might be some little bits here and there that we might choose to read in the next 2 or 3 months here, just to color the way that we do our conversations and how we tackle some of these stories. So with that, I want to thank everyone for following this broadcast. As far as, there's another thing I want to work in here. Chelsea Manning has been in jail for resisting a grand jury subpoena now for 259 days. She owes $150,000 in fines, and each day that she resists, she is charged $1,000. So that's one case we want to constantly update you on as we do the show. Julian Assange has been in jail at Her Majesty's Prison Belmarsh in the UK for 229 days. His extradition hearing is February 25th, 2020. And I plan to go to London in order to cover his hearing. And I'm making arrangements now, talking to people, doing what will be necessary in order to get into at least wherever the media is going to be hanging out. It'd be nice to be in the courtroom, but if I can just see a live stream of what's going on, I feel like we'll be able to give you some first-person insight into how the U.S. government is going about making this extradition possible. Jeremy Hammond is now joined Chelsea Manning in the jail in Alexandria. He's being pursued for contempt because he won't testify before this grand jury. And, of course, we've got Reality Winner, who's still in a prison serving her sentence as one of the first whistleblowers to be prosecuted under Donald Trump. And Terry Albury is another one, FBI whistleblower, who is in prison right now. And upcoming next year, we don't know exactly when the trial is going to be, but there's an alleged drone whistleblower, Daniel Hale, who we're mindful of here over at Shadowproof, and we'll be looking for when his dates are in case there's a necessity to go up there and cover. I would expect to be traveling to go cover Daniel Hale's case. So I believe that does it. Thank you for following the show. I'll let Brian conclude for us.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. This was great. Appreciate talking to you as always. We'll have more details on Kevin's trip to cover Assange's trial and how you can help us do that. We, as always, will be raising money from our readers to get that done. In the meantime, hit that subscribe button below, please, to keep on top of this show. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at ShadowProofCom. And you can support us for a few dollars a month to, again, help Kevin go on these reporting trips, to fund freelance reporting from journalists from around the country on a whole wide swath of issues. Just go to shadowproof.com/donate. We have member perks from tote bags to a members only newsletter and a chat room. And so your donations go directly to that. And I just wanted to say thanks again, and we will talk to you next week.
Yeah, everybody, it's been great. So give us your comments or any suggestions that you have. We really appreciate whatever feedback we get. The first show that we did, which only reached a few dozen of people, but it still seemed like people were really pleased that we're starting this kind of a show. And so glad to be doing it. We'll be back next week.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.